Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by Inner City Press. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Cameras flickered, reporters froze. The next witness called wasn't on anyone's radar. Not the press, not the defense, and certainly not the public. Kamala Harris, the judge announced. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The Vice President of the United States had just taken the stand. What she revealed under oath about Diddy and Barack Obama would shake the foundations of power in America. And this is where everything began to unravel. No one in the courtroom was prepared for what happened next. The judge glanced down at the list of witnesses, adjusted his glasses, and said it plainly. Next witness, Kamala Harris. The air changed. What had been a routine day in a high-profile trial instantly turned into something else entirely. The Vice President of the United States was walking to the stand. Gasps echoed across the room. Some jurors looked at each other in disbelief. A few reporters nearly dropped their pens. Even the defense attorney, who had seemed composed all morning, blinked like he'd just seen a ghost. She entered without security detail, without makeup, without even the hint of a press team. Just Kamala, alone, flanked only by U.S. Marshals. She wasn't there as a politician. Not today. She wore a dark navy suit. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, hollow and heavy, gave her away. You could see it. Something had cracked open. No podium, no statement, no political theater, just a woman who looked like she'd carried something for far too long. She sat down quietly, adjusted the microphone with trembling fingers, and took a breath that sounded like it had been waiting to be exhaled for 20 years. Then her voice came, low, steady, and impossible to ignore. I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd have to talk about this. But it's time. Those words didn't just set the tone, they shattered it. The judge leaned forward. The prosecution froze mid-note. Even the stenographer paused, needing a moment to catch up. And then Kamala dropped the first of many bombs. I knew Sean Combs, she said, her voice calm but raw. I knew him closely, but not in the way the public assumes, and not in the way I ever consented to. A stunned silence followed. Somebody in the gallery gasped audibly. A juror covered her mouth. You could feel it. The entire room trying to recalibrate what they thought they knew. Because this wasn't the Kamala Harris they saw on campaign stages. This wasn't the sharp, composed leader giving speeches at rallies. This was something else. Something deeper, darker, and devastatingly human. Kamala looked down for a moment, then back up. Her jaw clenched slightly, betraying the internal war she was still fighting as she spoke. This is not about political damage control, she continued. It's about truth. It's about accountability. And it's about what I allowed to happen by staying silent for too long. Every camera in the courtroom was now frozen on her. Not a whisper, not a foot shuffle, just the weight of what she had just said, settling like ash. And with that, she began her story. Kamala didn't waste time with pleasantries. After her stunning opening, she dove straight into the moment everything began. Fall of 2003, a weekend retreat that, on the surface, looked like any other exclusive gathering of elites. But beneath the surface, it was something much darker. She described the invitation as casual, routine even, delivered through a mutual acquaintance, an entertainment attorney who framed it as a networking opportunity between influential artists and rising public servants. These kinds of events weren't unusual, especially for someone like Kamala, who was then serving as San Francisco's district attorney. But from the moment she arrived, something felt off. There was no schedule, no formal welcome, just a convoy of black cars winding up a remote hill in Napa Valley. No signage, no staff introductions, just tall gates, high fences, and silence. Inside the mansion, the setting was extravagant, but strangely sterile. She said it felt like a movie set, a scene curated to look inviting but lacking soul. The kind of place where everything looked expensive, but no one looked comfortable. Some of the faces were instantly recognizable. CEOs, musicians, politicians, people you'd expect to see on TV, not casually mingling in candlelight. But no one introduced themselves. No one asked questions. No one even mentioned why they were there. Phones were taken at the door. Cameras nowhere in sight. Conversations were short, clipped. It was as if everyone had already been briefed on the unspoken rules, and Kamala was the only one still trying to figure them out. Then she saw him again. Sean Diddy Combs. He greeted her like they were old friends. A kiss on the cheek, a warm smile. That signature charisma he was known for. "You've made it," he told her, looking her dead in the eye. "Now let's see what you're made of." At first, she brushed it off as more of his showman bravado, but as the night went on, she began to notice subtle things. How conversations paused when he walked by, how people shifted their posture around him, how the room's energy bent toward wherever he stood. He wasn't just a guest, he was the center of gravity. Dinner was served, but it wasn't really about the food. Conversations were vague, smiles felt forced. Everyone seemed to be performing some version of themselves, measured, careful. Then, as the plates were cleared and the wine glasses refilled, a quiet announcement came. "We're heading downstairs." No further explanation, just a slow procession toward a spiral staircase that led into a dimly lit basement. Kamala remembered the flickering lights, the low, ambient music, the smell of candle wax and expensive cologne. The walls were lined with people, masked, silent, watching. "It wasn't a party," she said. "It was a test." And that's when she saw him. In the corner of the room, half shrouded in shadow, stood Barack Obama. He wasn't president yet, not even the face of national hope, just a rising figure with a growing presence in political circles. But even then, he mattered. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. "He wasn't the Barack we know today," Kamala whispered, "but he was already important, already aware." The atmosphere grew heavier by the second. This wasn't just an elite hangout. It wasn't networking. It was something orchestrated, controlled. Kamala's voice trembled slightly as she described what came next, but she didn't stop. "I don't know what his role was, but he knew exactly what this was. And he didn't stop it." The jury was motionless. Reporters stopped typing. Viewers watching the live stream were frozen, clutching their phones. This wasn't a scandal, it was a system, and this was just the beginning. Kamala Harris had made it this far, thinking she was just playing the game, working the political chessboard like everyone else. But what happened next shattered that illusion forever. After the unsettling descent into the candlelit basement, after the hushed glances and veiled rituals, Kamala was led away, again by Diddy. But this time, it wasn't casual. This time, it felt rehearsed. They walked past the wine cellar, down a narrower hall, and into a smaller chamber. She described the space as almost ceremonial, dimly lit, richly furnished, disturbingly silent. Inside, a long table stretched from wall to wall. But it wasn't set with food or drinks. It was covered with documents, neatly arranged. No titles, no explanations, just stacks of contracts, NDAs, and papers with legal jargon that blurred at the edges. A staffer, unnamed and expressionless, handed her a pen. "You'll want to sign," Diddy said, smiling faintly. "Everyone does." Eventually, Kamala paused. Something inside her screamed not to, but the room around her whispered louder. She signed. No one explained what the contracts meant. No one offered a copy. No one needed to. That moment, her signature on the page, was the price of entry, the door that locked behind her without her even hearing it close. "I didn't ask questions," she confessed. "That was my mistake." But the real turning point came moments later. Diddy handed her a glass of champagne with one hand, and in the other, a dossier, a thick manila folder, labeled with her name. "Your future is in here," he whispered, "but so is your silence." When she opened it, her stomach dropped. Inside was a surveillance profile, years in the making. Emails, photos, campaign notes, lists of donors, opponents, even records of private conversations she couldn't remember being recorded. They'd been watching her, long before she ever walked into that estate. It wasn't just unsettling, it was surgical. A psychological ambush masked as mentorship. She wasn't being offered opportunity. She was being shown how little of her life actually belonged to her. "I realized they didn't just know me," Kamala said. "They owned pieces of me I didn't even realize I'd given away." The folder wasn't a threat, it was a deal. And in that moment, she understood the rules had changed. "You can run for anything you want," Diddy told her. "I'll make sure you get there, but you don't speak on what happens in these rooms. Ever." Kamala hesitated, then admitted something the courtroom didn't expect. "I didn't know whether to be horrified or honored," she said. The two feelings blurred. She tried to rationalize it. "It's just politics," she told herself. "It's strategy." But deep down, she knew. It wasn't strategy, she confessed. It was submission. The courtroom was still, not just because of the words, but because of how many people understood exactly what she meant, without ever having to say it out loud. And then, she delivered the line that made even the judge shift in his seat. "Barack was in the hallway when I left. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me and nodded, like he understood, like he'd been there before." That wasn't confirmation. It wasn't accusation. It was something more chilling: recognition. Kamala Harris had crossed a line that night, and she wasn't the only one who had. After that night at the estate, after the signatures, the silence, and the dossier, Kamala's life began changing fast. Too fast. Doors that had been sealed shut were suddenly wide open. Donors she hadn't contacted started calling her office. Endorsements from high-profile figures she'd never even met showed up unannounced. Her poll numbers rose, not gradually, but like someone had flipped a switch. "It felt like magic," she admitted to the court, "but I knew it wasn't magic. It was him. It was Diddy." Behind the scenes, he was orchestrating every move, and with each success she achieved, there was always a cost. The first sign was a phone call. Late one night, her cell phone lit up with a number labeled unknown. She hesitated, answered, and heard nothing at first, just silence, then a voice. "We're proud of you." That was it. No name, no instructions, just a statement that felt more like surveillance than support. After that, the calls kept coming. Always unknown, always brief, always unsettling. "Don't forget who helped you get here. Keep doing what you're doing. We're watching." Some nights, it was just breathing. She stopped answering unknown numbers, but the messages didn't stop. Soon, envelopes began showing up, hand-delivered. No return address, no postage. Inside, news articles about her success, speeches she had given, event photos from her campaign trail. But then came the photos. Not current ones. They were from the estate. Kamala standing at that long table, sitting in the dimly lit lounge, her name written on a file folder. In one photo, Barack Obama could be seen blurred in the background, half turned away, half watching. "They weren't threats," she explained. "They were reminders that my success wasn't entirely mine." She told herself to ignore it, to move forward, to pretend none of it had happened. But the silence didn't protect her. It only deepened the illusion that she was in control. In 2013, things escalated. She walked into her Sacramento office early one morning. Everything looked normal until she reached her desk. There, placed precisely in the center, was a small black box. No note, no label, no indication of where it had come from. Inside, a flash drive and one typed sentence. "The deal is the deal." Kamala didn't plug it in immediately. She waited weeks. Part of her hoped that ignoring it would make it go away. But eventually, curiosity and fear won. "What I saw," she told the jury, her voice cracking. "I can't describe it all, but it was footage from that night, from other nights. People I knew, people I still know." The imagery was burned into her mind. They were crying, naked, trapped. She stopped speaking for a moment, eyes glassy. The courtroom held its collective breath. "Some of them are senators now," she said quietly. "Some are judges. One is running for president." And that's when the courtroom truly understood. This wasn't just about Kamala Harris. This wasn't even just about Diddy. This was a system, a web of power, silence, and shadow influence that stretched across politics, entertainment, and the American elite. Then came the question that lingered over the whole trial like smoke. Why didn't she go to the authorities? Why didn't she report it? Kamala didn't flinch. "Because I was terrified," she said. "Because I knew if I went down, so would everyone else, and none of them would let that happen. She stared straight ahead, unblinking, calm. But under that calm was a storm the courtroom couldn't look away from. The trap wasn't physical. It didn't need to be. The trap was built with favors, reminders, and the subtle but constant echo of a single message. You owe us. By 2014, the control Kamala had once convinced herself was just political strategy had become something much harder to ignore, and far more dangerous. She had tried to put distance between herself and the invisible hands pulling strings behind her career. She ignored the phone calls. She declined invitations. She started pushing back quietly, testing the boundaries. But power, real power, doesn't like to be ignored. That year, she was visited by a man she'd never met. He didn't have a name, just a letter. Mr. T. No appointment. No warning. He appeared in her office lobby one afternoon, like a shadow with a purpose. When her staff turned him away, he didn't argue. He simply left behind an envelope. It was marked with 3 characters, 4K. Inside was a single photograph, her mother's house. No caption, no threat, just the image. Crisp, clear, unmistakable. That was the message. I got it immediately, Kamala told the courtroom. I understood. I was still being watched. And they weren't just watching me. That's when Barack Obama re-entered the story. A week later, she got another call. Unknown number. But this time, the voice on the other end wasn't vague or anonymous. It was unmistakably him. Kamala, he said. Calm. Quiet. It's not about you anymore. It's bigger than all of us now. Just ride the wave. Don't crash it. She remembered sitting there in stunned silence. The voice of a man once seen as the epitome of hope, progress, and integrity, now sounding eerily like a handler. Ride the wave, she repeated on the stand. It sounded like advice, but it felt like a warning. She couldn't tell if he was trying to protect her or protect himself. That single phrase echoed in her head for months. Ride the wave, don't crash it. It was as if he wasn't offering guidance. He was giving her the only option left. The prosecutor asked her directly, "Do you believe Barack Obama was part of Diddy's operation?" Kamala looked down. Her hands trembled slightly. "I think he was aware," she said softly. "I think he saw it up close. Maybe even participated. But more than anything, I think he was afraid too." Those words landed like a punch. Not because they were loud, but because they were honest. Kamala wasn't claiming to have all the answers. She wasn't playing politics. She was finally admitting what everyone in power is taught never to say out loud, that sometimes even the most powerful people feel trapped. And then came the roses. She began receiving a single white rose, delivered to her office without a note, every time she rose in the polls or gave a powerful public statement. No explanation, no message, just the flower. At first, it felt like a gesture of approval, a nod from behind the curtain. But the deeper she thought about it, the more it sickened her. It wasn't love. It wasn't support, she told the jury. It was control, a reminder that they were still watching, that they still owned part of me. And for years, she let them, because resisting meant more than political fallout. It meant her family, her legacy, her very identity could be destroyed. Until this trial, she said. Until now. By 2016, Kamala Harris had tried everything she could to bury what happened. She rationalized it, suppressed it, filed it away in some emotional archive labeled necessary evil. But the memories didn't fade. They sharpened. And no matter how far she rose in public life, one part of her always remained in that basement in Napa Valley. One part of her still stood frozen in front of that long table, staring at that folder with her name on it. So she went back, not as a politician, not even as a woman seeking closure. She went back as a survivor who needed to know one thing. Was it real? "I told everyone it was for a wellness retreat," she said, "but I didn't go there for peace. I went to see if I had imagined it all, or if I had survived something much darker." The estate had changed hands by then. It was no longer a private retreat for the elite. Now it was listed on Airbnb as a high-end vacation rental. But even luxury can't scrub away what happened behind closed doors. When she arrived, everything looked cleaner. New, renovated, sanitized. The wine cellar was restocked, the floors polished, the furniture replaced. But Kamala wasn't there for the decor. She asked for a specific part of the house, the basement level. More specifically, the room behind the wine cellar. The staff looked confused. The listing had no such room, but Kamala knew better. She walked herself downstairs, heart pounding in her chest. Each step felt heavier, like walking into a crypt. And then, she found it. Behind a wooden wine rack, disguised like part of the architecture, was a panel she remembered vividly. She pressed her hand against it. Nothing. Then she leaned in, feeling along the edge, and clicked a hidden latch. The panel shifted. Behind it, a narrow, locked door. Still there, still untouched, just like in 2003. "My hands were shaking," she said. "I didn't know what I'd find, or if I even wanted to know." She broke the lock herself. Inside was a room frozen in time, deep red velvet walls, no windows, a low leather sofa, an antique projector mounted in the ceiling, thick with dust, and in the center of the room, an empty file cabinet, its drawers slightly ajar as if something had been taken and never replaced. But the most haunting detail wasn't the furniture or the files. It was what was carved into the wood above the fireplace. The phrase she said she could never forget: "Obedience keeps you fed." Those 4 words landed like a knife. The courtroom gasped when the image was shown, submitted into evidence, printed clearly in black and white. The words were unmistakable, burned into the grain of the wood like a brand. "I took a photo," Kamala said softly. "It's real. It was always real." She stood in that room for nearly 20 minutes. No crying, no breakdown, just stillness. She wasn't just seeing a place. She was standing inside the exact moment her freedom had been taken. "And for the first time," she said, "I realized I wasn't the only one who had passed through that room." That wasn't a guess. It was a realization that came not from fear, but from confirmation. Confirmation that this wasn't a one-time incident. It wasn't an isolated trap. It was a system built to lure, bind, and quietly consume anyone who got close enough to power to be dangerous. Kamala left that estate different than she entered. Before, she had questions. Now, she had evidence. She didn't need to wonder anymore. She knew. After returning to that estate in 2016, after unlocking the past with her own hands, Kamala Harris had every reason to run. And she almost did. She considered stepping down from public office. She even drafted a resignation letter and saved it to her personal drive. Untitled, unsigned, but ready. "I didn't want to carry this anymore," she admitted. "I thought maybe if I just disappeared, someone else would carry it. Someone braver, someone less compromised." But silence doesn't release you. It just tightens around your throat more slowly. Years passed. Kamala rose in prominence. California Attorney General, U.S. Senator, Vice President. With every upward step came another envelope, another white rose, another whispered reminder that her success wasn't hers alone. Then, in late 2023, the headlines started breaking. Diddy. A federal investigation, allegations, witnesses, whispers that were finally turning into reports. Kamala didn't speak, not yet. But the moment she saw that name flash across the news crawl, something inside her shifted. And then the reminders began again. One letter came to her home, no return address. Inside was a thick piece of cream-colored paper, expensive, textured, deliberate. Printed in large serif font were 9 words. "You're in the room even when you think you've left it." She froze. That was the exact phrase Diddy had whispered to her in the basement over a decade earlier. A sentence no one else should have known. A sentence that didn't just remind her of what happened, but who had watched it happen. "That's when I knew," she told the court. "They hadn't forgotten me, and they never would. Not until I either folded or spoke." For weeks, she wrestled with the decision. Speak and lose everything. Stay silent and keep dying slowly. She weighed the risk to her career, her legacy, her family. Then, one day, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, she was handed a witness list. It was part of a routine legal review. But one name on that list stopped her cold: Cassie Ventura. Kamala said she didn't know Cassie personally. They had never crossed paths. But as she read Cassie's early testimony, she broke down, right there in her kitchen. "I realized I wasn't alone," she said. "She wasn't alone. None of us were. There was a trail of silence, waiting to be broken." That was the moment everything clicked. It wasn't about saving herself anymore, it was about stopping the machine. Shortly after, she said, an anonymous source contacted my office with a simple message: "You know what he's done. If you don't speak, no one will." That was it, the turning point. The fear didn't vanish. It never does. But something else rose to the surface, something louder than her dread: conviction. "I couldn't hide anymore," she said. "Not behind my title, not behind my fear. I was done being complicit in my own silence." She didn't go public with a press conference. She went to court because she didn't want this to look like a stunt. She didn't want to be seen as managing optics. She wanted truth, raw, ugly, human truth, recorded under oath, on the record, where it could never be walked back. Kamala Harris sat taller in her seat as she said the words that would soon echo across every media outlet in the country. "I don't know how this trial will end, but I know how my silence ends. It ends today." And just like that, the room changed. Not because the truth was comfortable, but because it was finally undeniable. The courtroom was quiet. Still, not the kind of silence that follows a lull, but the kind that follows a bomb. Kamala Harris had just declared the end of her silence. Not on a stage, not in a press release, in sworn testimony. Now, she was no longer testifying, she was confronting. The prosecutor sat back. There were no more questions, just one final moment. The floor was hers. Kamala didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, gripped the microphone with both hands, and spoke like someone who knew the world was listening, not just to her words, but to her reckoning. "We failed," she began, "all of us who knew and said nothing. All of us who accepted power and ignored the price it cost others." She looked up. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. Jurors, lawyers, reporters. And then him, Sean Diddy Combs, seated at the defense table, arms folded, expression unreadable. She stared at him like she had waited years to say what came next. "You created a world," she said, voice sharp, "where fear looked like loyalty, where silence looked like strength, where no one dared say no." The jury shifted in their seats. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her eyes locked on Kamala. Then Kamala turned to the room again. The courtroom, the press, the live stream audience across the world. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone's career," she continued. "I came to destroy the illusion that these things don't happen. The illusion that fame and power somehow exempt you from consequence." And just like that, her focus snapped to the future. Not politicians, not celebrities, girls, young women, watching, waiting, learning. Kamala pulled a folded sheet of paper from her folder, a statement she had written alone the night she made her decision to testify. "This isn't for the court," she said. "It's for the girls, the ones watching, the ones growing up thinking that being in the right room with the right people is what power looks like." She unfolded the paper. "If the price of entry is your dignity," she read aloud, "you're not in a room, you're in a trap." A gasp came from the back of the room. Even some onlookers, hardened, cynical courtroom veterans, were blinking back emotion. The judge didn't stop her. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room understood. This was no longer testimony. This was confession, catharsis, confrontation. Kamala continued reading. She spoke about the cost of climbing through corrupted ladders, about how each rung brought success, yes, but also silence, and how every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a version of herself that had bartered truth for survival. "You called it networking," she said, her voice beginning to tremble. "You called it mentorship. You called it the game. But it was none of those things. It was a cage." She looked up from the page, no longer trembling. "And I'm done pretending I wasn't locked inside it." No one moved. Not a single cough. Not a shuffle. Just the sound of her words landing like hammer blows in a courtroom already scorched by revelations. Then she stepped down. No fanfare. No victory pose. Just a slow, steady walk from the witness stand, her heels echoing against the marble floor like a countdown to something irreversible. She didn't look back, because this wasn't about performance anymore. It wasn't about Diddy or even Obama. It was about a system, a blueprint for control built on silence, enforced by favors and maintained by fear. Outside the courtroom, the media descended into chaos. Reporters were speechless. Pundits scrambled to reframe. Political analysts whispered about damage control. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because those who listened understood. This wasn't politics. This wasn't theater. This was a reckoning. As Kamala Harris exited the courtroom, no one moved. Not the judge, not the jury, not even the press. The echo of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound, each step landing like a slow metronome counting down to something irreversible. There were no shouted questions, no media chaos, no last-minute flashes of light, just stillness. Outside the courthouse, crowds had already gathered, some in disbelief, others in quiet awe, and more than a few, speechless. Livestream commentators were left repeating headlines they never imagined they'd say. Vice President Kamala Harris testifies against Sean Diddy Combs. Implication of Barack Obama sends shockwaves through Washington. But the headlines couldn't capture the full weight of what had just happened. Because Kamala didn't just expose a man. She exposed a blueprint, a hidden structure of loyalty, favors, and forced silence, wrapped in the language of opportunity. She hadn't just testified, she detonated the myth of invincibility that surrounds the powerful. And that detonation sent ripples through the heart of every institution it touched. Behind closed doors in Hollywood, agents and executives scrambled. In Washington, aides whispered in corridors. And in Silicon Valley, emails marked urgent carried subject lines like, "Do we have any connection to this? Is she naming more names?" Because Kamala hadn't just named Diddy or Obama, she named the system. The defense tried to recover, calling her words exaggerated, delusional fiction, as they put it. But no one believed them, not entirely, because even those who didn't want to admit it recognized the truth beneath the cracks. The White House issued a statement, just 2 sentences. Non-committal, distant. Obama's team declined to elaborate, but silence, in this case, said more than any speech could. Later that night, the footage of Kamala leaving court replayed on every major network, over and over. No makeup, no entourage, no protective veneer of politics. Just a woman, stripped of image, stripped of illusion, human, haunted, and finally, heard. The clip went viral. Clips of her final words, "If the price of entry is your dignity, you're not in a room, you're in a trap," were shared by activists, former officials, even celebrities who once remained silent. Some called it bravery, others called it self-preservation, but everyone called it unignorable. And as the dust settled, one truth began to rise above the noise. Kamala Harris didn't just name names, she named a hidden culture, a machine designed to look like opportunity, but built for control. And now that she's spoken, the question isn't, will more come forward? It's, who already knows? And is still staying silent? Because the real story isn't just what Kamala revealed. It's what her testimony dared the world to ask next. How many others are still locked in the room, thinking they left it behind? If you watch this far, you already know this story can't just disappear. Like, share, comment what part hit you the hardest. And if you think this goes deeper than anyone's admitting, you're not alone. Subscribe for part 2. This was just the beginning.